The legend of the 1st Marine Division did not begin with glory, nor with medals, nor with victory, but with the sound of rain hammering against the tin roofs of makeshift barracks in a world far from home, where young men hardened long before their time laced their boots in silence, aware that the battles awaiting them would not merely test their courage but consume entire parts of their souls. And as dawn crept across those Pacific horizons, soft orange bleeding into the deep blue of another blistering day, the Marines stood in formation, their uniforms damp with humidity, their weapons cleaned by hand so many times the metal felt like an old friend, and they listened to their officers speak of an enemy unlike any other they had faced, an enemy that preferred to die rather than surrender, that burrowed into jungles like specters, that struck without warning and vanished into darkness as though the night itself obeyed them. The 1st Marine Division had come to the Pacific as a capable fighting force, but no one, not even the highest-ranking generals, could have predicted the transformation they would undergo, the crucible that would forge them into a unit Japan learned to fear so deeply that even seasoned soldiers whispered about them in the shadows of palm thickets and volcanic ridges. Their story truly ignited on Guadalcanal, where the Marines stepped onto the beaches not with the roaring confidence of conquerors but with the cautious determination of men who understood that every inch of ground they captured would be contested with blood. The tropical air clung to their skin like a suffocating blanket as they dug foxholes in soil crawling with insects, swatting away mosquitoes as Japanese artillery barked from hidden ridges. Many Marines arrived with no experience in jungle warfare, but in days, mere days, they learned to spot enemy camouflage by the unnatural stillness of leaves, learned the rhythm of night assaults when Japanese forces charged in banzai waves screaming in the darkness like demons released from ancient myths, learned the meaning of exhaustion when sleep was a luxury stolen between artillery barrages, learned the weight of hunger as supply lines thinned and every bite of food became a reminder that they were alone on an island thousands of miles from salvation. Yet the Marines held. They held Henderson Field with knuckles white from gripping rifles, held their lines against attacks so ferocious that even the most hardened veterans later admitted that Guadalcanal was the closest hell could come to earth. In the jungles where daylight barely filtered through thick canopies and the ground stank of mud, rot, and decay, a bond began to form among the men, an unspoken pact that no Marine would leave another behind, that their division's strength was the sum of every man's discipline and willpower, and as they patrolled through waist-high swamps, nerves strung tight as tripwire, they began to understand the truth. Surviving Guadalcanal required more than training, it required becoming something relentless, something unbreakable. Japan had believed the Marines would crumble under jungle conditions, that disease and heat stroke and constant ambushes would break their lines, that their morale would shatter under the mental strain of warfare where the enemy could be 10 feet away or 10 miles away. Instead, the Marines adapted faster than any Japanese planner expected. They learned to fight at night, learned to aim by sound and instinct, learned to strike first, learned that hesitation meant death. In their foxholes, they whispered to each other about the Japanese soldiers who moved like ghosts, but soon the Japanese whispered back, about Marines who charged even when outnumbered, about Marines who fought after being wounded, about Marines who counterattacked when any other army would retreat. Word spread through Japanese ranks that the Americans on Guadalcanal were different, fiercer, refusing to break even when starving, even when isolated, even when surrounded, and the first seeds of fear took root. At night the jungle vibrated with the sounds of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures, and the quiet prayers of soldiers who knew that dawn brought no guarantee of survival. But the 1st Marine Division pushed deeper into the island, rooting out Japanese pockets one ridge at a time, one foxhole at a time, their discipline turning chaos into calculated destruction. They suffered horribly, malaria, dysentery, tropical rot, but every loss only sharpened their resolve. And when Japanese reinforcements attempted to retake Henderson Field in one final, massive assault, the Marines formed a line that would become legend, weary, filthy, half-starved men standing shoulder to shoulder in the darkness as Japanese troops charged at them in a storm of gunfire, screaming, "Tenno Haika Banzai!" yet breaking against the Marine line like waves breaking on rock. By dawn, the field remained in Marine hands, and Japan realized the brutal truth. Guadalcanal was lost, not because the Marines outnumbered them, but because the Marines refused to yield. That refusal, that iron discipline, that unshakable courage, traveled with them to every island that followed, transforming the 1st Marine Division into a force the Japanese High Command feared so deeply that entire defensive plans were rewritten simply because intelligence reports indicated that the Marines, those Marines, were coming. And as the memory of Guadalcanal burned itself into the marrow of every Marine who survived it, the 1st Marine Division carried that hard-earned ferocity with them across the Pacific, sailing toward their next hell, the steaming, rain-drowned nightmare known as Cape Gloucester, where the jungle was not merely terrain but a living, suffocating enemy of its own, choking the air with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth, and turning every step into a battle against mud that swallowed boots, roots that tangled legs, and swarms of insects that bit through uniforms as though the Marines were nothing but warm prey trespassing in a place nature never intended men to stand. And as the ships approached the coastline, the Marines felt the familiar tightening in their chests, the instinctual bracing for what awaited them on shore, where Japanese defenders had carved bunkers into the rainforest itself. Concealed by the dripping green canopy, waiting with rifles, machine guns, and mortars ready to turn the beach into a graveyard. The landing began with a roar of naval bombardment that shook the coastline, trees collapsing in showers of splinters and smoke, but the Marines knew the truth. No amount of shelling ever cleared everything. There were always hidden trenches, always tunnels, always soldiers waiting underground. As the landing craft ramp dropped into chest-high surf, the Marines surged forward, weapons held above the water, packs dragging them down, shells exploding around them, and the stench of cordite mixed with salt water filled their lungs as they pushed toward the dark wall of jungle that loomed ahead like the entrance to something ancient and unforgiving. The moment they reached the tree line, the world changed. Sunlight vanished, replaced by choking shadows, heat intensified into a suffocating blanket, mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, and visibility dropped to mere feet as vines coiled across their paths and massive ferns brushed their helmets. Here, the Japanese defenders awaited them not in trenches but in silence, letting the jungle do the work until the perfect moment to strike. What the Marines had learned on Guadalcanal became their lifeline: move slowly, watch for signs of unnatural stillness, listen for subtle shifts in the canopy, expect fire from every direction. Japanese snipers perched high in the trees like predatory birds, their rifles wrapped in foliage, waiting to strike with a single, lethal shot that echoed through the forest like a whip crack. Yet the Marines pressed forward in tight formations, their senses sharpened by experience, their discipline the only thing preventing total chaos. Patrols returned bloodied, exhausted, whispering about enemy foxholes so well hidden they blended seamlessly with the jungle floor, about booby traps fashioned from sharpened bamboo that pierced boots and flesh alike, about sudden nighttime infiltrations where Japanese units crawled through undergrowth, slipping past lines unseen until the moment they unleashed grenades and screams in the darkness. Still, the Marines adapted. They created perimeter systems with interlocking fire zones. They trained themselves to spot tripwires and disturbed leaves. They developed hand signals to communicate silently through the undergrowth. They fought not just with rifles but with instinct, learning the jungle's language, turning its suffocating presence into an asset rather than an enemy. In torrential downpours that turned foxholes into muddy pits and soaked uniforms until they clung to skin like cold rags, the Marines advanced slowly but relentlessly, clearing Japanese positions one bunker at a time with grenades, flamethrowers, and sheer determination. Each assault was a brutal, intimate struggle, fought at ranges so close the Marines could feel the heat of their own explosives, smell the charred wood of burning fortifications, hear the final cries of enemy soldiers refusing to surrender even at the brink of death. Every ridge they captured came at a cost, every patrol through the jungle left men shaken and hollow-eyed, but their advance never stopped, not for weather, not for disease, not for exhaustion, not for fear. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies with night attacks and ambushes, found themselves facing an opponent who refused to break, refused to retreat, refused to die on schedule. Reports filtered back through Japanese communications lines. The American Marines counterattack even when bleeding. They advance even when sick. They fight like men possessed. And with every report came the same conclusion. We cannot stop them. The 1st Marine Division became not just a military unit, but a force of nature, reshaping the battlefield by sheer will. And when they finally secured Cape Gloucester after weeks of backbreaking combat, they left behind a jungle littered with abandoned enemy fortifications, shattered artillery pieces, and the footprints of men who had been transformed yet again, harder, tougher, almost unrecognizable from the young recruits who had boarded the ships months earlier. As they prepared for their next island, the veterans spoke openly. Guadalcanal changed us, but Cape Gloucester sealed it. What awaited them next, however, would push even these hardened warriors beyond anything they had endured so far, an island the Japanese believed absolutely impregnable, a fortress of coral and rock and fire that would test the limits of every Marine who set foot upon it. That island was Peleliu, and the Japanese were convinced that no American force, no matter how disciplined, could survive its horrors. They had no idea that the 1st Marine Division was coming, or that their arrival would shatter every expectation Japan had left. Peleliu emerged from the steaming Pacific like a jagged scar of coral and limestone, its coastline glittering deceptively in the sun as if inviting the Marines toward its white beaches. But every man aboard the transports approaching the island knew the bitter truth. Beneath those gleaming sands lay a labyrinth of bunkers, tunnels, and concealed firing positions that Japanese engineers had spent months perfecting, creating a fortress so intricate and deadly that even seasoned officers feared the cost of the coming battle. And as the 1st Marine Division gathered in their briefing rooms, tracing their fingers over maps riddled with enemy fortifications, they could feel the tension thickening the air. This was no simple landing, no swift campaign, but a trial by fire the likes of which even Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester had not fully prepared them for. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the old tactic of banzai charges, replacing them with a strategy of calculated attrition, promising his men that the Americans would bleed for every inch of ground, that the island would become a grinding mill of flesh, sweat, and terror, designed to break the spirit of the invaders long before they reached the island's vital airstrip. Yet the Marines, hardened by every nightmare they had already endured, boarded their landing craft with jaws set, rifles checked for the 10th time, helmets strapped tight, the rising sun glinting off the metal as the engines roared to life. As they neared the beach, naval bombardment intensified, battleships hurling shells the size of small cars into the island, sending plumes of coral and dust geysering into the sky. But the Marines watched something unsettling. The shelling destroyed trees, shattered surface bunkers, and burnt foliage, yet the deeper fortifications remained eerily intact, their entrances invisible, their defenders hidden like phantoms beneath the earth. When the ramp dropped and the first wave stepped into chest-deep surf, all hell erupted. Machine gun fire lanced from unseen slits in the ridge ahead, mortars shrieked overhead, and the sand beneath their boots exploded in columns of white-hot fragments. The Marines charged forward anyway, their breath burning in their lungs, the heat already blistering, the sun reflecting off the coral so intensely it felt like fighting inside a furnace. The moment they crossed the beach, the true horror of Peleliu revealed itself. The Unending Mountains, jagged, razor-edged limestone ridges, rose like the spine of some ancient beast, each ridge filled with cave systems interconnected by tunnels that allowed Japanese defenders to vanish, reappear, flank, and strike from angles impossible to anticipate. Here, the Marines encountered a level of resistance unlike anything before. Firefights erupted at distances so close Marines could see the whites of enemy eyes, grenades bounced off rocky inclines, and flamethrower operators became the most valuable men in each squad, their fuel tanks strapped to their backs like ticking bombs that drew relentless sniper fire. Water became rarer than ammunition, sweat pouring off faces in sheets as temperatures soared above 110 degrees. And canteens emptied faster than supply could deliver them. Marines collapsed from dehydration, their tongues swollen, their helmets baking under the sun, their uniforms stiff with salt and dust, yet they continued climbing ridge after ridge, clearing each cave one brutal inch at a time. The Japanese defenders fought with a calm, methodical precision that astonished even seasoned Marines. They would let a squad pass, then emerge behind them, ambushing from blind angles, forcing the Marines to fight forward and backward simultaneously. Casualties mounted so rapidly that battalion commanders stared at their maps in disbelief, seeing entire companies reduced to skeletal shadows of their original numbers within a single day. But the 1st Marine Division did not break. At times, they advanced less than 100 yards in an entire day, and yet they advanced. Teams coordinated tactics specifically for the island, using satchel charges to collapse cave entrances, flamethrowers to force hidden defenders into the open, demolition men to seal tunnel exits. The fighting became so intimate, so close, that Marines described the island as one long, never-ending knife fight. Bodies lay sprawled in the heat, flies swarming like black clouds, the smell of decay mixing with burning fuel and the metallic scent of blood. Marines slept sitting up against rocks, rifles across their knees, eyes half open because sleep was a luxury only the dead received on Peleliu. Despite the misery, they pushed forward with the same relentless determination that had defined them since Guadalcanal. Each ridge they took, Hill 100, Hill 120, the Five Sisters, the Horsehull, came at a staggering human cost, but their discipline never wavered. Japanese commanders became alarmed at the reports streaming in. The Americans do not stop. They attack even when exhausted. Even when bloodied. Even when surrounded. The 1st Marine Division fought as if the island had become a personal enemy, and each Marine knew that the only way off Peleliu was through it. As the weeks dragged on, the Marines decimated the Japanese defenders, clearing stronghold after stronghold until the island's resistance began to crack. Nakagawa, realizing that reinforcements would never come, ordered his remaining troops into a last stand within the Honeycomb Hills, an interconnected cave fortress buried deep inside the Yumurbergal. But even there, the Marines hunted them with the same precision and fury they had displayed since the beginning. Day after day, they fought through darkness illuminated only by muzzle flashes and flickering flames, the air so thick with smoke and dust that breathing felt like inhaling fire. Yet, gradually, the Japanese positions fell one by one. And as the last pockets of resistance collapsed, the surviving Marines staggered back down the ridges, their bodies covered in grime, their cheeks hollow, their helmets scorched, but their spirits unbroken. Though Peleliu would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives, the Japanese High Command recognized something undeniable. If the 1st Marine Division could survive Peleliu, could conquer an island designed to annihilate them, then Japan had no force capable of stopping them anywhere in the Pacific. And as the Marines prepared for their next destination, an island closer to Japan than any they had yet faced, their reputation spread across both armies like a storm rolling across the sea. Okinawa awaited them like a monstrous, brooding storm swollen with death, an island far larger and deadlier than anything the 1st Marine Division had ever faced, its ridges rising in jagged tiers, its villages turned into bunkers, its cliffs honeycombed with tunnels stretching for miles beneath the earth. And as the Marines approached its shores through choppy seas whipped by early spring winds, a silence settled over the decks of their transports, not the anxious quiet of inexperienced men, but the solemn stillness of veterans who had learned that every new island demanded a piece of their lives they would never get back. Okinawa was the doorstep to Japan itself, and both sides understood what that meant. The Japanese would defend it as if defending their own homeland, while the Americans would seize it as the final stepping stone to ending the war. The air trembled with tension as battleships and cruisers began a bombardment so thunderous it rattled metal, shook teeth, and sent columns of smoke spiraling into the clouds, yet the Marines watching the coastline sensed something unnerving: no return fire, no flashes of enemy artillery, no visible signs of life at all. It was as if the island were holding its breath. And when the landing craft surged toward the broad Higuchi beaches, the Marines braced themselves for the same violent welcome they had received at Peleliu or Tarawa, expecting machine gun bursts and mortar shells to tear through their ranks, but instead they stepped onto the sand unopposed, the quiet haunting them more deeply than any gunfire ever could, because they knew this silence was not mercy, it was a trap set with cold, calculated purpose. The Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, had chosen a strategy of deliberate withdrawal, allowing the Marines to take the beach without resistance so they would push inland into the island's deadly interior, where the Shuri Line, a fortress of interconnected ridges, caves, and concrete, waited like a beast crouched in shadow. As the Marines advanced, the terrain shifted from open fields to rising ridges drenched in mist and mud, and when they reached the first outlying hills, the sky erupted. Machine guns from unseen slits shredded the air, mortars rained down in relentless waves, and artillery hidden deep within the hills opened fire with a precision that tore apart entire platoons in seconds. The Marines dove for cover as shrapnel sliced the air, the earth exploding around them in geysers of smoke, dirt, and blood, and the tranquil landing they had experienced minutes earlier vanished beneath a storm of fire. They dug in, returning fire with rifles and machine guns, calling for mortars and naval support, but the Japanese defenders did not fight like they had on previous islands. They fought with patience, discipline, and lethal cunning, emerging from tunnels to attack, then disappearing before counterfire could reach them. The Marines realized immediately that Okinawa would not be a battle of swift advances but a grinding, soul-crushing war of attrition, with every ridge a fortress, every hill a tomb, every cave a trap. As they slogged forward, rain turned the battlefield into a morass of sticky mud that sucked at their boots, soaked their gear, and reduced movement to a miserable crawl. Dysentery spread like wildfire, exhaustion hung from every man's shoulders, and the constant shelling shattered nerves until even veterans flinched at the sound of a twig snapping. Corpsmen worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded from the mud as shells burst overhead, their white armbands smeared with blood and dirt. Marines pressed cloth against their ears to block out the endless thunder of artillery, some shaking uncontrollably during rare moments of stillness. But even then they held the line, because there was no retreat, no escape, only forward, always forward. They fought across Kakazu Ridge, where every attempt to climb its steep, mud-slicked slopes was met with lethal crossfire from Japanese machine guns concealed in the rock, and where flamethrower teams advanced through curtains of bullets to scorch the cave mouths from which enemy fire erupted. They fought at Maeda Escarpment, later called Hacksaw Ridge, where the cliffs rose like a wall of jagged teeth, and Marines scaled ropes under fire, dragging themselves upward as grenades rolled down from above, the explosions flinging men from the rocks like ragdolls tumbling into the void below. They fought in conditions so horrific that even the most battle-hardened men felt their spirits fraying. Rain mixed with blood, forming slick crimson streams that pooled in shell craters, the smell of decay hanging heavy over the battlefield as bodies, American and Japanese, lay tangled in the mud, beyond retrieval. Yet through it all, the 1st Marine Division refused to break. When units lost half their men, the survivors formed new fire teams. When commanders fell, sergeants took command without hesitation. When ammunition ran low, Marines crawled over open ground under fire to resupply, knowing each movement could be their last. And every day, despite the toll, they advanced, yard by bitter yard, forcing the Japanese farther back into the collapsing Shuri line. Japan's commanders, stunned by the Marines' resilience, wrote in their reports, "The Americans do not understand the meaning of defeat. Even in hopeless situations, they advance." The psychological impact of facing the 1st Marine Division became as devastating as their firepower. Japanese defenders realized that even their most carefully constructed strongholds could not hold back these men indefinitely. And still, Okinawa continued to devour lives. The fighting intensified as the Marines pushed deeper into the defensive heartland, where the terrain narrowed into kill zones, and every valley became a funnel of death. Kamikaze pilots screamed out of the sky in desperate attacks against American ships offshore, sending up columns of flame that lit the night like burning pillars. But the naval support held firm, providing artillery and medical evacuation at unimaginable costs. Back inland, Marines fought through torrential rains that turned battlefield dust into a suffocating fog, obscuring friend from foe until firefights erupted at distances so close the muzzle flashes illuminated faces twisted with fear and fury. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, sleep came in stolen seconds, and every Marine carried the weight of not just survival but inevitability. The knowledge that this island was the last shield before Japan itself, and that the enemy would fight to the final breath. Yet the Marines pressed on with the same relentless, iron discipline that had carried them through Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. Ridge by ridge, cave by cave, they dismantled the Shuri line, their faces hollow, their boots worn through, their hands blistered from constant firing, but their resolve burnished into something indestructible. And as the Japanese positions began to crumble under the sustained assault, the High Command finally understood a truth that had become bitterly clear across the Pacific. Wherever the 1st Marine Division landed, the outcome was already written. They were not simply soldiers, they were a force of inevitability, a storm front of discipline, ferocity, and unbreakable unity that Japan, for all its courage and preparation, could not stop. And as the fighting at Okinawa reached its peak, the Marines stood on the threshold of victory, unaware that the final months of the war would bring revelations, decisions, and consequences that would reshape not only the Pacific but the world itself. As the rains eased and the smoke of burning villages drifted across the scarred hillsides of Okinawa like a mourning shroud, the Marines of the 1st Marine Division pushed deeper into territory where the cruelty of war seemed to intensify with each passing day, and though they had grown hardened to the sight of death, the sheer scale of devastation on Okinawa weighed heavily on their spirits. For everywhere they looked, across shattered ridgelines, through bomb-cratered fields, along roads littered with wrecked artillery, they saw echoes of a people caught between two armies, civilians fleeing not just gunfire but hunger, disease, and the collapse of everything they had ever known. But the Marines had no time to dwell on the human tragedy unfolding around them, because the Japanese defenders, still entrenched within the last network of tunnels beneath the Shuri line, fought with the desperation of men who understood they were making their final stand. Every cave became a fortress, every hillside a battlefield, every meter of ground a contest fought with grenades, flamethrowers, bayonets, and bare survival instinct, and the Marines, weary beyond comprehension, pressed on through a haze of exhaustion that made their vision blur and their limbs feel like lead, yet discipline held them upright and purpose drove them forward like a tide that refused to recede. Nights were filled with the dull thud of artillery, the metallic clatter of spent casings, and the distant echoes of cries that faded slowly into the damp air. Each morning, the Marines rose with faces hollowed by fatigue, lips cracked, uniforms stiff with dried mud and sweat, but their resolve remained unbroken, fueled by camaraderie forged in the furnace of suffering. They fought with a sense of inevitability, not arrogance, but grim understanding, that if they faltered the costs would be borne by every man beside them, and so each Marine became the anchor for the man next to him. Storming yet another ridge, they used smoke grenades to blind enemy gunners, crawled on their stomachs through the mud under fire so thick it cut down saplings like scythes cutting wheat, and maneuvered flame teams as if choreographing a deadly dance, one Marine laying suppressive fire while another advanced with a flamethrower tank hissing on his back, knowing full well he was the primary target of every enemy rifle inside the ridge. The flames roared into cave mouths, illuminating twisted shapes and shadows on the limestone walls, and after each blast, the Marines waited in tense silence before continuing their methodical advance, knowing that even one surviving defender could turn the next moment into a bloodbath. Despite everything, heat, insects, disease, lack of water, constant shelling, the Marines continued to adapt, shifting tactics from open assault to systematic reduction of strongholds, drawing from every lesson learned across earlier battles. And all the while, Japanese commanders wrote in their journals, "The Marines do not tire. They do not stop. They return again and again, like waves against the cliff." As the Shuri line finally began to collapse under the relentless pressure, the last of the Japanese defenders withdrew southward, collapsing tunnels behind them, using scorched earth tactics to deny the Marines supplies, and leaving booby traps hidden in corpses, caves, and collapsed shelters. Every step forward came with a new threat. Even when the Japanese retreated, their traps continued to hunt the Marines long after they had passed. And yet the Americans pressed on until they reached the remnants of the command center, now in ruins, its rooms filled with the scent of smoke and spent ammunition, its walls etched with the marks of desperation. The Marines who entered the final chambers found little: a few empty shell casings, scattered documents, and the bodies of officers who chose suicide rather than surrender. Outside, the island seemed to exhale as the thunder of battle faded, but the Marines felt no elation, no triumph, only the quiet heaviness of men who had carried the weight of thousands of lives on their shoulders and now found themselves confronting the scale of what they had endured. Yet, as they regrouped and bandaged wounds, As supply ships arrived offshore to replenish what exhaustion had drained, a new realization settled into the hearts of every Marine. Japan, seeing what had happened on Okinawa, what the 1st Marine Division had endured and overcome, would understand that the Americans were capable of surviving even the worst the Empire had to offer. Japanese strategists knew this division was the blade poised at their throat, the unstoppable force marching closer to their homeland with each battle. In Tokyo, senior officers debated desperately how to confront a unit that had, time and again, refused to break under conditions that should have shattered them. Memos circulated filled with words like unyielding inhuman stamina and psychological dominance, and whispers spread among soldiers stationed in Japan's coastal defenses. If the Marines come, no line will hold. For the 1st Marine Division, however, Okinawa marked a turning point, a moment where they realized their struggle was not merely against enemy soldiers but against time, fatigue, and the looming possibility of an invasion of Japan itself. And as the men cleaned their rifles, tended their wounds, and stared across an ocean now shrinking between them and the Japanese mainland, a question formed silently in every mind: if Okinawa was this brutal, what horrors awaited them next? Yet though fear lingered, one truth steadied their hearts. The Marines had faced the deadliest islands Japan could build, the strongest defenses its architects could conceive, the most fanatical soldiers its ideology could produce, and through it all, they had remained standing. And if fate demanded it, they would stand again. As the last echoes of battle faded across the shattered ridges of Okinawa and the smoke of burning villages drifted low across the ruined valleys, the 1st Marine Division found itself not in celebration, nor in triumph, but in a strange, heavy silence. The silence of men who had survived more than they could comprehend, who looked at the corpses of friends being carried to makeshift cemeteries and understood, with a depth no words could capture, that the war had taken from them far more than it had ever given. Yet, while the Marines processed what they had endured, half a world away the effect of their unbroken advance reverberated through the highest levels of Japan's military command, where weary generals stared at maps cluttered with red arrows pushing closer and closer to the homeland and spoke in hushed tones about the division that had become the embodiment of American inevitability. Intelligence reports described the 1st Marine Division with phrases that chilled even the most stoic officers. They do not falter, they fight even when outnumbered, they advance even when wounded. And the shockwaves of their pitiless momentum across the Pacific forced Japan to confront the terrifying truth that no defensive strategy, no massed battalion, no complex network of tunnels or ridges, had been able to stop the Marines anywhere they had landed. Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Okinawa, each island had been declared impregnable by the Japanese High Command, and yet in each one, the 1st Marine Division had carved its way through, leaving behind destroyed battalions, shattered fortresses, and defensive lines that collapsed like sand under the weight of a rising tide. Now, as Japan's remaining leaders debated how to confront the coming American invasion, the name 1st Marine Division hung over every conversation like a dark omen, and officers quietly warned their superiors that morale among Japanese troops was eroding faster than anyone dared admit. Soldiers whispered that if the Marines landed on Kyushu or Honshu, no amount of training, no oath to the Emperor, no bamboo spear drills forced upon civilians, would stop the relentless wave they had seen crush the best of Japan's army in the jungles and ridges of the Pacific. For the Marines still stationed on Okinawa, however, the idea of invading Japan itself filled them not with pride, but with dread, a dread they tried to bury beneath humor, routine, and the camaraderie that had saved their sanity time and time again. They cleaned their rifles, repaired torn uniforms, and wrote letters home under starlit skies, pretending that the next operation would be bearable, pretending their bodies weren't broken, pretending their minds weren't haunted by the faces of men lost on the slopes of Peleliu or in the fire pits of the Shuri line. In whispered conversations inside their tents, Marines spoke of rumors, millions of Japanese soldiers preparing defensive positions, civilians being trained to fight with bamboo spears, predictions of casualties so monstrous they seemed unreal. Some men admitted quietly, trembling despite themselves, that after Okinawa they were not sure how much more they could endure, yet none spoke of refusing orders, none considered stepping back, None imagined letting someone else bear the burden they had carried this far. Their discipline had long since evolved into something primal, something shared, a sense that they had come too far and sacrificed too much to falter now, that whatever waited in Japan would be met with the same iron will that had carried them through every island behind them. But the Marines would never have to storm Japan's shores. Fate, in the form of a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, intervened before the 1st Marine Division could be unleashed on the Japanese homeland. When the news arrived that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb, an entire city reduced to ash in a moment, Marines stared at the communiques in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend the scale of such destruction. And then, only days later, when a second bomb fell upon Nagasaki, the war that had consumed the world for nearly 4 years shuddered to its violent end. Official announcements cascaded across the Pacific like shockwaves. Japan had agreed to surrender. The fighting was over. Men who had spent years preparing themselves to die in the mud and fire of an invasion they believed inevitable sat down where they stood, some laughing, some crying, some simply staring into the distance, as the realization settled in that they were going home, not in coffins, not as broken shells, but alive. Yet for many Marines, the end of the war did not bring the closure they expected. Instead, it opened a chasm inside them, a sudden emptiness replacing the constant tension, fear, and survival instinct that had defined their existence since Guadalcanal. Their bodies would return home, but their minds would forever walk the jungles of Cape Gloucester, climb the razor ridges of Peleliu, and crawl through the blood-soaked mud of Okinawa. As the 1st Marine Division boarded ships for the long journey back to the United States, they carried with them the heavy pride of having played a decisive role in ending the most brutal war humanity had ever waged, but also the grief of knowing they were leaving behind thousands of brothers who would never see home again, men whose names would be carved into white crosses, whose stories would live only through those who survived. When the ships finally reached American shores, crowds lined the docks, waving flags, cheering, crying, welcoming the men who had stormed into hell and come back changed in ways no one but fellow Marines could ever understand. Yet even in those moments of celebration, the 1st Marine Division remained humble, their commanders reminding them that the legacy they carried was built not on glory but on sacrifice, discipline, and an unbreakable bond forged in the most hostile battlefields on Earth. And across the ocean, in Japan, historians and military leaders began to study the war that had ended so suddenly, tracing the arcs of battles and realizing with sobering clarity that long before the atomic bombs fell, Japan's defeat had been sealed not by machines or strategies, but by men like those of the 1st Marine Division, whose relentless advance across the Pacific crushed every hope of a Japanese counteroffensive and shattered the myth of an invincible empire. In time, veterans of the 1st Marine Division would tell their stories in fragments, never the whole truth, never the full weight of what they had endured, but just enough for the world to understand that when they landed, Japan could not stop them. And so their legend grew, written not in myth or exaggeration, but in the brutal, undeniable reality of every battlefield they conquered. Wherever the 1st Marine Division went, the outcome of the war changed. Wherever they fought, Japan lost ground. And wherever they landed, the war bent toward its end, not because they were superhuman, but because they were Marines, trained to move forward no matter the cost, bonded by a brotherhood stronger than fear, and driven by a resolve that turned islands into milestones on the road to victory. And though decades would pass, and the veterans of those battles would become old men with stories etched into the wrinkles of their faces, one truth would remain as clear and immovable as the day it was forged in fire: Japan could not stop the 1st Marine Division. No one could. As the 1st Marine Division settled into the uneasy calm that followed the end of Okinawa, the weight of years spent fighting across the Pacific clung to them like the thick humidity that rose each morning from the shattered landscape, and as they rebuilt their camps, cleaned their weapons, and waited for orders that would determine whether they lived to return home or died on the shores of Japan, they could not shake the sense that the war, even if technically over, was not yet finished within them. For even as Japan prepared to surrender, the Marines remained on edge, conditioned by 3 years of ambushes, banzai charges, sniper fire, and the constant, suffocating pressure of jungle warfare. They had learned not to trust silence, not to believe in safety, not to accept anything at face value in a war where every shadow might hide a rifle, every civilian might hide a grenade, and every ridge might conceal a fortified line waiting to explode in violence. And while news of the atomic bombs swept across the ranks like a shockwave of disbelief, the Marines knew that surrender was a process, not an instant, because Japanese soldiers had proven time and time again that they would fight to the last man, the last breath, the last drop of blood, and many officers feared that even an official surrender might not be enough to stop isolated pockets of resistance from erupting into sudden violence. When the division received orders to prepare for occupation duty, the mixed emotions ran deep: relief at not having to storm Japan's shores, dread at stepping into a defeated but still proud nation, and uncertainty about how a people conditioned for years to see Americans as demons would react when the Marines disembarked as conquerors rather than invaders. Some Marines expected ambushes, others suspected traps. Many believed they would walk into streets lined with civilians ready to fight with anything they had left. But none could truly imagine what awaited them: a Japan beaten not just militarily, but spiritually, its people exhausted, starving, and crushed by the realization that everything they had been told about their empire's invincibility had been a lie. When the 1st Marine Division arrived in Japan, stepping onto soil that only months earlier had been the heart of their deadliest enemy, they were struck not by armed resistance, but by the haunting stillness of a nation in shock, children staring with hollow eyes as American convoys rolled past, elderly men bowing weakly as Marines walked through shattered streets, and women clutching infants, as though bracing for horrors that would never come. Instead of hatred, the Marines encountered confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense of despair among people who had been prepared to die because they believed the Americans would slaughter them. But the Marines did not come for revenge. They came to enforce peace, and many were surprised to find themselves stepping into roles they had never imagined: mediators, protectors, and symbols of a future that Japan had not dared to believe could exist. As they patrolled the ruins of cities flattened by war, Marines gave out food to hungry children, helped rebuild shattered infrastructure, prevented desperate civilians from stealing out of starvation, and worked alongside Japanese officials to restore order. And in doing so, they began to see Japan not as a faceless enemy, but as a nation of people whose lives had been twisted by propaganda, tyranny, and militaristic fanaticism. This unexpected shift in perspective weighed heavily on men who only months earlier had fought bitterly against Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender, and while the Marines carried the trauma of those battles deep inside them, many found a strange relief in the chance to build rather than destroy. Still, as peaceful as the occupation was on the surface, the memories of the Pacific Campaign clung to them like scars, and in the quiet nights when they sat together smoking cigarettes on barrack steps, conversations inevitably drifted back to Guadalcanal's malarial jungles, Cape Gloucester's endless downpours, Peleliu's blistering heat, and Okinawa's bone-soaking rains that had turned battlefields into graveyards of mud and blood. They remembered friends who had fallen next to them, officers who had led them through fire, and enemies who had fought with terrifying devotion. And even as they walked the peaceful streets of defeated Japan, their minds drifted back to the sounds of machine guns, mortar blasts, and the screams of wounded Marines echoing across ridges illuminated by tracer fire. Yet, for all their internal battles, the 1st Marine Division remained disciplined, respectful, and focused, traits that even Japanese citizens came to admire, for word spread quickly that the Marines treated civilians with fairness and restraint, maintaining order without brutality, enforcing rules without cruelty. Japanese elders who once warned their children that Americans were monsters now watched quietly as Marines repaired bridges, cleared debris, protected food shipments, and ensured that the black market did not strangle the starving population. Slowly, cautiously, trust began to grow. Some Japanese children, still trembling with fear, approached Marines who smiled and offered candy. Shopkeepers reopened their doors when convinced they would not be looted. Local officials discovered that American officers were willing to listen, to negotiate, to understand the cultural complexities that governed daily life. For the first time in years, Japanese citizens saw soldiers not as instruments of death, but as humans, weary and wounded in their own ways. Meanwhile, in American camps, Marines wrote letters home describing a Japan very different from the one they had imagined, beautiful landscapes untouched by war, temples standing with serene dignity, and people who bowed repeatedly, grateful for kindness rather than fearful of slavery. Some Marines visited shrines and gardens, marveling at the peacefulness they found there, unable to reconcile it with the brutality they had endured in the Pacific. Others formed friendships with local workers assigned to assist the occupation. Many found themselves reflecting on how propaganda on both sides had twisted perceptions into monsters that did not truly exist. But even in these quiet moments, the Marines could not fully escape the memories of what Japan's soldiers had done on the islands. Friends bayoneted in their sleep, Marines booby-trapped by retreating defenders, prisoners tortured or executed, civilians encouraged to jump from cliffs rather than surrender. This duality, the cruelty of Japan's military contrasted with the kindness of its civilians, created an emotional storm inside the Marines, who struggled to reconcile the two faces of the nation they had fought so fiercely. Some Marines spoke bitterly of the horrors they had experienced, unable to forgive. Others softened, understanding that civilians had been victims of their own government. Many simply carried the weight in silence, knowing no explanation could ever untangle the contradictions. Yet through it all, the 1st Marine Division maintained order with discipline unmatched by any other unit, and Japanese officials privately admitted that if any American division had to occupy their homeland, they were fortunate it was the Marines. The same men who had stormed their strongest defenses but who now enforced peace with calm professionalism. Still, beneath this fragile tranquility, Japan's military leaders grappled with the devastating truth that they had finally begun to understand fully. The reason they could not stop the 1st Marine Division was not simply American firepower, training, or technology. It was the Marines' mindset, their refusal to die quietly, their inability to accept defeat even when wounded, starving, or exhausted. Japanese officers studied battle reports from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and concluded that while Japan's soldiers fought bravely, they lacked the adaptability and cohesion that defined the Marines, who could reorganize under fire, who could improvise when cut off, who could counterattack even when ambushed, who could keep moving forward when logic said they should collapse. And as this realization spread through Japan's surviving officers, many admitted privately that the Marines had become the enemy they respected most, not because they were invincible, but because they were unbreakable. Some Japanese veterans later wrote in memoirs that facing the 1st Marine Division felt like fighting fate itself. Every hill they defended eventually fell, every counterattack eventually failed, every night raid eventually turned into a slaughter, because the Marines simply refused to stop. Even in defeat, Japanese officers told their sons and grandsons about the division that had carved its way across the Pacific with terrifying precision, hoping that future generations would learn from the discipline and unity of their former enemies. And for the Marines, the occupation became not just the end of the war, but the beginning of the long journey back to themselves. Because only now, as the guns fell silent and the islands faded into memory, did they finally have to confront the ghosts they had carried from battlefield to battlefield, ghosts that would walk beside them for decades to come. As months passed in occupied Japan and the initial tension gave way to routine, the Marines of the 1st Marine Division found themselves living in a strange limbo, a world where they were both conquerors and caretakers, warriors ready for violence yet expected to maintain peace, battle-hardened veterans surrounded not by enemies firing rifles but by civilians struggling to rebuild their lives from ashes. And this contrast created an emotional undercurrent that shaped every day in subtle but powerful ways. They patrolled streets that had once been vibrant and now lay half destroyed, their boots crunching across broken tiles and glass while Japanese families emerged from surviving homes to bow respectfully before returning to the slow, painful process of reconstruction. Marines learned to interpret the gestures, the expressions, the quiet Japanese politeness that masked suffering, and though they were strangers in this land, many began to feel a reluctant empathy for people who had been dragged into war by leaders they never chose. Yet beneath the surface of calm order, the strain of years of fighting still gnawed at the Marines' minds. Night after night, the Pacific reappeared in their dreams, the roar of artillery echoing through the jungles of Guadalcanal, the sweat-soaked terror of Peleliu's ridges under white-hot sun, the screams carried by wind across Okinawa's ravines. And even though they were now walking peacefully through Japanese villages, Those memories lived in every shadow and every quiet moment. For some Marines, the silence of occupation was harder than the chaos of battle. In war, their purpose had been simple: advance, survive, protect the man beside you. But in peace, that clarity dissolved into a haze of uncertainty, and Marines often gathered at dusk outside their makeshift barracks, smoking cigarettes and staring across the rooftops of a defeated nation, while wondering who they were now that the fighting had ended. The officers sensed this psychological tension and shifted their leadership approach accordingly, emphasizing discipline, routine, and community engagement. Men were encouraged to help repair schools, assist with food distribution, and interact with local families to deepen mutual respect. Slowly, stories emerged of unexpected friendships: Marines helping rebuild a fisherman's torn nets, a Japanese shopkeeper teaching a corporal how to write his name in kanji, children gathering outside camp gates waiting for candy handed out from ration boxes. These small moments did not erase the trauma of the Pacific, but they softened the edges, creating a fragile but meaningful bridge between those who had once tried to kill each other. Meanwhile, high-ranking Japanese officials, many ashamed, others still in disbelief, held meetings to analyze how their empire had collapsed so completely. Intelligence officers reviewed documents gathered from battlefields, testimonies from surviving soldiers, and intercepted Allied reports, piecing together a grim truth they had avoided during the war. The 1st Marine Division had not been stopped on any island because they had mastered the art of adaptation. When Japanese defenses relied on banzai charges, the Marines created interlocking fields of fire that turned charges into slaughter. When Japan shifted to cave systems and fortified ridges, Marines developed new tactics: flamethrower teams, demolition squads, coordinated tank infantry assaults. When disease and jungle conditions were used as weapons, Marines improved sanitation, supply distribution, and medical response. Japanese commanders realized with painful clarity that understanding the Marines after the fact was useless. Their true strength lay not in numerical superiority, or even American industrial power, but in the cohesion of their small units, the trust between officers and enlisted men, the improvisational instincts that allowed squads to function even when leaders were killed. Reports compared Japanese platoons, rigid, rule-bound, inflexible, to Marine platoons that could reassign roles instantly, make decisions independently, and execute complex maneuvers without waiting for detailed orders. One Japanese colonel wrote in a post-war reflection, "We lost every island long before we fought for it, because the Marines had already mastered the environment, the tactics, and the will to endure what our men could not." This admission spread quietly among Japan's remaining officers, shaping the early post-war military studies that later influenced Japan's modern self-defense forces. For the Marines, however, the war's lessons came at an unthinkable human cost. Rifle companies that had landed with 180 men on Guadalcanal often ended with fewer than 40 by the time they reached Okinawa. Some companies had been rebuilt 3 or 4 times across the campaign. Marines who had never expected to live past 22 now found themselves occupying foreign barracks in peacetime, their youthful faces aged by what they had seen. Mail from home brought news of weddings, births, and booming American factories, but Marines felt detached from the lives they had left behind. They had missed too much. They had survived too much. They had changed too much. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "I don't know what home will feel like anymore. I only know how to fight, survive, and go forward. Peace feels like waiting for something I can't see." Others struggled with guilt. Survivors' guilt toward the Japanese civilians they saw suffering, guilt toward the friends buried beneath islands scattered across the Pacific. But even as these emotional battles played out internally, the Marines maintained the discipline that had defined them since the war began. They executed every order, upheld every standard, and ensured that Japan transformed from an enemy empire into an occupied nation without chaos or vengeance. Meanwhile, American military leadership, analyzing occupation reports, began to understand the true strategic value of the 1st Marine Division, not just their combat ability, but their stability, professionalism, and ability to transition from ferocious fighters to responsible peacekeepers. Senior officers quietly noted that the division's presence prevented unrest in regions where Japanese police forces had collapsed. General Roy Geiger remarked privately to staff that he trusted the 1st Marine Division to handle peace with the same grit they handled war, and his confidence proved well placed. But beneath the professionalism, the Marines felt the weight of the Pacific Campaign follow them like a shadow they could not escape. When they stood guard on quiet Japanese streets, they remembered standing guard in blackened palm forests on Guadalcanal. When they watched Japanese families ration powdered rice, they pictured starving Marines on Cape Gloucester boiling jungle roots for food. When they walked past Shinto shrines where incense drifted through the air, they recalled Peleliu's coral ridges where the stench of death had lingered for weeks. When they heard distant thunder roll across mountains, many flinched instinctively, hearing not thunder but artillery. The Marines carried ghosts, hundreds of them, and though peace offered them rest, it did not offer them release. Still, the division held together because they had always held together, through exhaustion, wounds, loss, and the darkest moments of the war. Their brotherhood remained the glue that kept them grounded. They ate together, trained together, held memorials together, drank together, and shared stories under dim lanterns that flickered like fireflies in the night. Some laughed for the first time in months. Others cried when no one was looking. All knew the truth. Nothing would ever erase what they had been through, but they had survived, and survival was a victory in itself. As the months of occupation continued, Japan began to rebuild with remarkable speed, guided partly by American oversight and partly by the discipline and resilience of its own people. Schools reopened. Markets filled slowly with food again. Factories rose from rubble. And through it all, the Marines watched with a mix of admiration and curiosity, realizing that while Japan had been their enemy, its people were not weak. They were capable, determined, and willing to rebuild a nation broken by war. More than once, Marines admitted quietly that if Japanese soldiers had fought with the same spirit as Japanese civilians rebuilt, the Pacific War might have been far bloodier, perhaps unwinnable. But the Marines also understood something critical. Japan had never faced an opponent like the 1st Marine Division, an opponent whose collective identity was forged not by imperial decree but by shared struggle, mutual trust, and a doctrine that placed adaptability and initiative above blind obedience. And in the end, that difference, more than tanks, more than planes, more than ships, had shaped the outcome of the Pacific War. As winter settled across the Japanese islands and a thin frost began to gather each morning on the wooden rooftops lining the narrow streets near the Marine occupation zones, the men of the 1st Marine Division found themselves experiencing a season unlike any they had known before. Not a season of battle, not a season of loss, but a season of reflection, of muted calm. Of watching a defeated nation quietly rebuild itself while they, the conquerors, struggled to rebuild their own fractured spirits. Snow dusted the shoulders of Marines patrolling through ancient shrines and war-torn markets, and the cold wind cut across their faces in a way that felt strangely cleansing, as though the world were trying to wash away the grime of the Pacific battles still clinging to their memories. Yet no matter how peaceful the streets seemed, the Marines remained alert, disciplined, and watchful, driven by instincts honed on islands where safety had always been an illusion. They moved through Japan with a quiet, controlled confidence, their presence reassuring to civilians and intimidating to any remnants of militaristic defiance, though such defiance became rarer by the day. For the Japanese people, the Marines became symbols of both defeat and stability, feared at first but gradually regarded with an unexpected respect, even gratitude, as stories spread of Marines protecting villages from looters, restoring water systems, distributing surplus rations to starving families, and treating civilians with a dignity they had not expected from the soldiers they had been taught to hate. Children who once hid behind their mothers now ran to the Marines with shy smiles, and though many Marines felt awkward at being seen as heroes by people whose nation they had fought so fiercely, they accepted this new role because it aligned with something deeply rooted in them, a belief that strength was not just the ability to win wars, but the willingness to protect the innocent, even those who had once been called the enemy. But beneath these peaceful interactions, the Marines continued to face their own internal wars. Some Marines walked the quiet streets at night unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of comrades lost in jungles thousands of miles away. Others sat alone on the shores of Japan's harbors, staring at the gentle waves and hearing in every splash the distant echo of gunfire from their battleships. Some found themselves triggered by sudden sounds, a dropped pot, a closing door, instinctively reaching for rifles that were no longer on their shoulders. The ghosts of Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa did not fade simply because peace had come. If anything, peace amplified them, because in the silence, the memories had space to breathe. Marines confided quietly in each other during midnight smoking circles, their faces illuminated by orange embers as they spoke about things they had never dared to say aloud during the war. The terror of being surrounded in the jungle, the guilt of surviving when friends died, the nightmares that replayed ambushes and explosions in endless loops. Their officers noticed the strain and adjusted their routines: more rest rotations, more recreational activities, more letters encouraged to be written home. But no policy could erase the weight they carried. The Marines were warriors, built for conflict, yet now thrust into a quiet world where their spirits had to relearn how to live without constant danger. Meanwhile, in government offices across Japan, senior military and civilian leaders analyzed the Pacific War with a cold clarity they had not possessed during the conflict. They pored over battlefield reports, post-surrender interrogations, and diaries recovered from fallen soldiers, searching for patterns, truths, and explanations behind their devastating defeat. Again and again, one conclusion surfaced: Japan had underestimated the Marines. They had believed that American soldiers were soft, that Western men could not endure the jungle, the heat, the disease, the shock of sudden night attacks. But the Marines had not merely endured these hardships, they had mastered them. Japanese officers studied accounts from Guadalcanal, finding descriptions of Marines fighting with fever temperatures that would cripple most men, Marines charging fortified positions in the rain with empty stomachs, Marines refusing to break even when surrounded. Reports from Cape Gloucester revealed that the Marines had outlasted even nature itself: constant rain, knee-deep mud, choking humidity that made rifles swell and boots rot, conditions that Japanese forces had expected would kill them before combat even began. Peleliu's documents were perhaps the most harrowing: Marines clawing their way up coral ridges under relentless heat, flamethrower teams burning cave after cave, rifle squads advancing through kill zones where every step invited death. And Okinawa, the final and fiercest test, where Japanese commanders had deployed their most elaborate defenses, trapping Marines in labyrinths of tunnels, cliffs, and artillery. Yet even there, the 1st Marine Division had broken their lines, pushing forward with a discipline that Japanese officers admitted in post-war interviews was beyond anything we believed possible. Some Japanese strategists argued that the Marines' success came from superior American firepower, better rations, or more effective logistics. And while these factors undoubtedly played crucial roles, senior officers eventually agreed on something deeper: the Marines possessed a culture of adaptability and unity unmatched by any force Japan had fielded. They were trained not to depend on rigid top-down orders but to make decisions on the ground. Squad leaders adjusted tactics on the fly. Riflemen took over roles of wounded leaders without hesitation. Platoons reorganized mid-battle. Communication flowed horizontally, not just vertically. Japanese squads, by contrast, often fought exactly as they had been trained: no innovation, no improvisation. And once their leaders were killed, confusion spread quickly, creating openings the Marines exploited with ruthless precision. A post-war Japanese general wrote, "The Marines fought as if each man carried the mind of their commander. We could not match that." This acknowledgement, though bitter, became foundational in Japan's eventual rebuilding of its self-defense forces, which adopted many organizational principles observed from the Marines. Back in Japan, as the occupation continued, Marines began to witness something extraordinary: not the collapse of a defeated nation, but the rebirth of a resilient one. Villagers rebuilt homes with salvaged wood and clay bricks, farmers returned to their fields despite ruined irrigation systems, teachers conducted classes in bomb-damaged schools with missing walls, and families planted vegetable gardens in abandoned lots to survive the winter shortages. The Marines watched this with admiration, recognizing in Japan's civilians a determination that mirrored their own. Some Marines even volunteered to help rebuild small communities, using their engineering knowledge to repair bridges or wells. In one village near their station, Marines helped restore a torii gate to a Shinto shrine that had been damaged by bombing, a symbolic gesture that deeply moved the villagers, who later offered the Marines hand-carved wooden charms as gifts of gratitude. Such moments did not erase the memory of war, but they helped stitch together a fragile respect between two peoples once divided by propaganda and bloodshed. Yet underlying this period of reconstruction was a sobering truth. The 1st Marine Division had become, in the eyes of Japan's military historians, a force that fundamentally reshaped their understanding of warfare. Japanese soldiers had entered the Pacific War believing they. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. Were heirs to a warrior tradition superior to any in the West, taught that spiritual strength and willingness to die for the emperor would overcome material disadvantages. But the Marines had exposed a fatal flaw in that belief. War was not won by spirit alone, it was won by adaptability, coordination, logistics, and the ability to maintain cohesion under chaos. Even in death, Marines had disrupted Japanese plans. Even when wounded, they had kept fighting. Even when facing overwhelming odds, they had executed small unit tactics with brutal efficiency. Japanese officers concluded that the Marines operated like a living organism, each part capable of independent action but always working toward the same objective, always moving forward, always maintaining momentum. And this realization, more than any battle, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Reports circulated among Japan's senior leadership describing entire battalions that refused to engage areas believed to contain Marine units, whispers of Marine demons, who fought with superhuman endurance, and rumors, half fear, half respect, that the Marines did not fear death. These myths, though exaggerated, reflected a brutal truth: Japan could not stop the Marines because the Marines would not stop themselves. As the occupation moved into its final months, many Marines began receiving orders to return home. The news sparked a mixture of joy, relief, and apprehension. They had dreamed of home for years, yet now the thought of returning to normal life felt impossible. What job could match the intensity of surviving Peleliu? What conversation could replace the bond of men who had held each other's lives in their hands? What peaceful neighborhood could feel like safety after Okinawa's hellish ridges? Still, they prepared to depart, packing duffel bags, taking final photographs with Japanese children, shaking hands with local officials who had grown to trust them, and saying quiet goodbyes to streets they had walked for months in uncertain peace. On the morning of their departure, thousands of Japanese civilians gathered silently along the roads leading to the harbor, bowing deeply as the Marines marched past. It was not a gesture of submission but of respect, a recognition that the men they once feared had become protectors in their hour of despair. When the 1st Marine Division finally boarded the ships that would take them back across the Pacific, many Marines stood along the rails, watching Japan's coastline fade into the horizon. Some felt satisfaction, others grief, and many a strange mixture of both. They had fought an enemy with ferocity, then guarded them with compassion. They had survived hell, then maintained peace. They had been instruments of destruction, then guardians of stability. And as the sea stretched endlessly before them, the Marines knew that while they were leaving Japan behind, the memories of their journey, from Guadalcanal's dark jungles to Japan's quiet streets, would follow them for the rest of their lives. They had become part of history, part of a story that Japan itself would study for generations, and though they returned home forever changed, one truth remained carved into the legacy of the Pacific War: Japan could not stop the 1st Marine Division, not on land, not in spirit, not even in defeat, for their will, their unity, and their relentless determination had reshaped the very course of the war. As the troop ships carrying the 1st Marine Division cut steadily through the vast Pacific, their wakes trailing behind them like long white scars across the dark blue water, the men lined the rails in silence, watching Japan's fading shoreline shrink into the haze until it disappeared entirely, leaving only memories of battles won, brothers lost, and a strange, fragile peace forged in the final months of occupation. And as the wind swept across the decks, carrying the salt of the ocean and the faint hum of engines deep within the hull. Many Marines found themselves thinking back on everything they had endured since the first time they stepped onto transports years earlier, when the war was young and unknowable, when they were boys wearing oversized helmets and carrying rifles that felt heavier than their courage, when they had no idea that places like Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa would carve themselves into their souls forever. They remembered stepping onto Guadalcanal's beach with fear gnawing at their stomachs, then fighting for months through disease, hunger, and ceaseless attacks until the island was theirs. They remembered the choking heat of Cape Gloucester's jungles, where even the trees seemed to rot and soldiers sank ankle-deep into mud with every step. They remembered Peleliu's burning cliffs, where men collapsed from heat stroke in numbers equal to casualties, and where every cave concealed an ambush that could wipe out a squad in seconds. And they remembered Okinawa's rain-soaked ridges, where artillery fell so relentlessly that the ground itself shook, and where Marines advanced yard by yard, knowing each ridge might be their last. Every man aboard those ships had lived a lifetime in just a few years, aging faster than anyone back home could ever understand. Some leaned quietly against the rails, their eyes unfocused as they replayed memories of friends who had died beside them, names etched into the heart but absent from the ship's roster, men who would never see the shores of their homeland again. Others talked softly in small groups, voices low as if afraid to disturb the ghosts around them, sharing stories not of heroism but of absurd moments, tragic ones, moments of brotherhood that had kept them sane during the worst days of the war. A shared can of peaches in a foxhole, a joke whispered before a charge, a cigarette offered to a wounded comrade. These were the memories that mattered, the ones that kept the dead alive in their hearts. And as the ships pressed onward, the Marines began to sense a shifting energy aboard, not excitement, not relief, but a slow, heavy realization. They were going home, yet they were not the same men who had left it. Many wondered what home would look like now. Would their families recognize them after all they had been through? Would they be able to return to normal jobs, normal routines, normal relationships? Could any world of peace ever feel real after living so long in the world of war? Some confessed to each other that they feared home more than they had feared battle, because at least in battle they had known who they were. As the voyage continued, the ship captains allowed Marines more deck time, knowing they needed space to decompress, to breathe, to look at the horizon and try to imagine their futures. Chaplains held quiet services at dusk, the sound of hymns drifting across the water as the sun dipped beneath the waves and painted the sky in shades of gold and blood red, the colors blending together like the war itself, beauty and violence, hope and loss. At night, many Marines slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, as though expecting a Japanese banzai charge to erupt from the dark, a reflex so ingrained that even the gentle rocking of the ship felt like the trembling of artillery. Their bodies had learned to survive in hell. Now they had to learn how to live in peace. Meanwhile, in the officers' quarters, senior leaders pored over documents summarizing the division's performance across the Pacific, preparing reports that would shape future Marine Corps doctrine. They wrote about how the division adapted faster than any enemy force, how small unit leadership proved decisive in jungle and island warfare, how logistical ingenuity kept them fighting even when supplies ran dangerously low, and how the character of the Marines, resilient, stubborn, unbreakable, had become a strategic weapon in itself. These reports would later influence training programs, command philosophies, and battlefield tactics across the Corps for decades. But to the enlisted men sleeping in hammocks beneath the decks, such things felt distant and irrelevant. What mattered to them was returning home alive, embracing family members they had not seen in years, walking streets where no one was trying to kill them, and reclaiming parts of themselves they feared were lost forever. When the ships finally approached the American coastline, a collective hush fell over the Marines. Fog obscured the distant shore at first, but gradually the outline of the land became visible, hills, cliffs, and buildings rising through the mist like ghosts of a world they had left behind. Some Marines cried without shame. Others gripped the rails so tightly their knuckles turned white. A few whispered prayers. As the ships entered the harbor, they were greeted by crowds that stretched as far as the eye could see, families waving flags, bands playing triumphant marches, news reporters pushing through seas of people, children holding signs covered with shaky handwriting welcoming fathers they barely remembered. The noise was deafening: cheers, whistles, horns, shouts of joy. It was overwhelming, almost unreal. The Marines stood in their dress uniforms, medals shining on their chests, but many felt a sense of discomfort. They had come home as heroes, yet carried memories that did not feel heroic. Some stepped off the ships into the arms of mothers who clung to them as though afraid to let go. Others embraced wives or girlfriends whose letters had sustained them through the darkest nights. Some searched the crowd for familiar faces that were no longer there. Their families had died while they were away, victims of illness or tragedy, leaving the Marines with no one to greet them. For these men, the cheers of strangers only deepened their loneliness. But regardless of circumstance, each Marine returned to a nation that could never fully understand what they had endured. America saw their medals, their uniforms, their victory. It did not see the sleepless nights, the buried trauma, the weight of loss they carried like invisible gears strapped to their backs. In the months that followed, the Marines scattered across the country, some returning to farms, others to factories, others to universities through the GI Bill, and some re-enlisting because civilian life felt too foreign. Those who stayed in the Corps became the backbone of a new Marine generation, passing on lessons learned through blood, shaping recruits with stories of islands whose names would forever define their identities. Those who returned to civilian life often found themselves drifting between moments of normalcy and sudden flashbacks triggered by sounds, smells, or familiar landscapes. Many felt isolated, misunderstood, or unfit for peaceful society, but they pushed forward with the same determination that had carried them across the Pacific. They started families, built careers, and contributed to communities, all while carrying the silent burden of memory within them. Meanwhile, in Japan, historians began writing comprehensive accounts of the Pacific War, analyzing the battles where the Marines had fought and identifying the turning points where Japan's fate had been sealed. Again and again, one conclusion emerged: the 1st Marine Division had been an unstoppable force because it fought with a blend of discipline, adaptability, and unbreakable spirit that Japanese forces could not match. The Japanese military had underestimated the Marines at every stage, believing their own warrior ethos made them superior, but the Pacific War proved that true strength came not from ideology, but from unity, training, leadership, and the will to endure hardship without breaking. Japanese officers wrote essays and memoirs admitting that the 1st Marine Division's relentless advance across the Pacific had undone Japan's defensive strategy island by island, shaping a path that led inevitably to Japan's defeat. The Marines had been the spearhead of the American push across the Pacific, the vanguard that cracked open Japan's defenses, disrupted its plans, and dismantled its hopes of victory. Their legacy was etched not only in American history, but in Japanese history as well, not as conquerors, but as a force that changed the course of the war itself. And so the story of the 1st Marine Division became a legend, whispered in barracks, recounted in books, honored in memorials. Decades later, aging veterans would sit in quiet living rooms, their hands trembling as they held faded photographs from Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa, telling their grandchildren stories softened by time but still carrying the weight of truth. They would speak not of glory, but of brotherhood, not of killing, but of survival, not of hatred, but of resilience. They would say that they did not win the war alone, but they had stood where many others might have fallen. And as these veterans looked back on their youth, they understood something profound. Japan had not been able to stop the 1st Marine Division because they had fought not as individuals, but as a single living force, bound by duty, shaped by hardship, strengthened by sacrifice. In the end, their determination, adaptability, and unity had carved a path across the Pacific that no army could block, no defense could hold, and no empire could survive. Their footsteps marked the islands they had fought on, their courage shaped the outcome of the war, and their legacy endured long after the last shots were fired. The 1st Marine Division had been more than a military unit. They had been a force of history, and history would never forget them. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.